This is what we're going to talk about this evening. We'll talk a little bit about completing the FAFSA and some of the frequently asked questions that we get. We've got some what-if scenarios, things that just, you know, some of them are questions that come up a good bit, unusual situations and that type of thing. I'm going to share with you different types and sources of federal aid and a little bit about each program so that you are getting familiar with the lingo. We have our own little language in financial aid. And so if you've never been down this road before, it can be a little overwhelming. And then we'll wrap up with questions. Okay. So it all begins generally in the student's senior year of high school by filling out the free application for federal student aid. You do that online at FAFSA.gov. Okay. There is a paper form. I don't encourage anyone to use it. It's hard to find actually now. They used to print paper forms and schools had them to give out. Over 99% of everybody who applies for the federal aid every year does it online. So the online process is by far the fastest. It also cuts down on the risk of errors. You're not having to move numbers quite as much, and you know there's an easy risk of transposing numbers and doing things like that when we're writing things down. If you have students who are juniors in high school right now, you can actually do what's called a FAFSA forecaster. It was designed for families with high school juniors. It is on the FAFSA website, so you still go to FAFSA.gov, FAFSA.gov. But what the forecaster will do is it's going to ask you information similar to the questions on the FAFSA, and then it's going to give you some estimated financial aid projections. Okay. You need to remember that they are estimated because it varies greatly depending on the school sometimes. It also varies from year to year, sometimes with federal allocations of money that is available. But what you can do, if you have a child that's a junior right now and you fill out the FAFSA forecaster, when they are a senior, you can actually populate some of the information on the FAFSA by pulling it from the forecaster, so you don't have to enter some of the demographic information again, like social security numbers, birth dates, that addresses that type of thing. Okay. This is what the FAFSA website looks like, and it generally takes families about 30 minutes to fill out the application. Now, if you don't have everything you need, it's going to take longer, of course, but if you have what you need available, about 30 minutes is all it takes. So I don't want you to get overwhelmed by the idea of filling it out, all right? Another nice feature of doing the application online is that the majority of families will be able to use what's called the IRS data retrieval tool. About 4 years ago, the Department of Education and the IRS finally figured out a way to share information. So it allows a FAFSA applicant to go from the FAFSA to the IRS website, retrieve your tax return information, and populate the FAFSA using that. It cuts down tremendously on the risk of mistakes because it is so easy to put numbers in the wrong box if we're filling them in, or to transpose numbers, and if you pull that information directly from the IRS, then there's just no risk of that happening. It goes exactly where it's supposed to go. Okay. So there are 7 sections on the FAFSA application, and again, this looks a little overwhelming, but remember you can do this in about 30 minutes. So there's student demographic information, student income information, then there's a section on determining the student's dependency status. Are they a dependent student for financial aid purposes or an independent student? We'll talk a little more about dependency status in just a few minutes. The parent information is gathered for students who are dependent, and then parent income information, some household information, how many people are in your household, how many of them are attending college, that type of thing. It will allow you to list about 10 schools that you want to send your information to. So if you're looking, you know, you may have it narrowed down to 3 schools, you may have one that you know is the school, or you may just really not have any idea at all yet and want to list 10. You can do any number of those up to 10, and then you electronically sign the application and submit it. And we'll talk about how you electronically sign it. Some of the information that it would be helpful to have on hand includes the student's driver's license number. You're going to need parent and student social security numbers, dates of birth, tax information. Again, most families are going to be able to retrieve their information directly from the IRS. There are some families that are not able to do so. If you turn out to be one of the families that can't use the data retrieval tool, then you're going to need your tax return information handy. It asks about asset information. It'll say, as of today, what is the balance in your savings or checking accounts? It will ask if anyone in the household has received any federally mean-tested benefit programs, things like food stamps or TANF. All of that's taken into consideration. If someone in the household receives disability or Social Security, if there are veterans benefits, all of those things are on the application, and it leads you through it pretty straightforward. There's some nice skip logic that's built into the online application, so it will automatically skip questions that don't apply to your family based on previous responses that you've provided, okay? I mentioned that you electronically sign the FAFSA, and the way you do that is by using what's called an FSA ID, a Federal Student Aid ID. The student has to have their own FSA ID, and the parent has to have their own FSA ID. Now, if you're a parent and you have twins that are coming to college, you don't need two FSA IDs for yourself. You're going to have one FSA ID for yourself, but each of your children are going to have their own, okay? To get the FSA ID, you can do it at the FAFSA website. You can also do it at fsaid.ed.gov, and you have an opportunity to create your own username and password. You will also set up some challenge questions that if you forget your user ID or password, you can answer those challenge questions. It's really very similar to the way you set up a user ID and password for your banking website, credit card, anything like that. The one thing I want to caution you about is that if you forget what your user ID or password are, and you can't answer the challenge questions, there is no one that can help you with that. The Department of Education cannot reset a password. A school cannot access the information. I have absolutely no way of knowing anything about what your user ID or password would be. Now, I was at a conference back in the summer, and someone from the Department of Ed was presenting, and they started talking about the FSA ID. And her words were, I cannot tell families to write this down somewhere and keep it safe because I work for the Department of Ed. You don't work for the Department of Ed, so you can tell families to write it down and keep it somewhere safe. So write it down, put it in a password app if you've got one, but hang on to it, because sometimes the problem arises when if the parents created a user ID and password for the student, then the student can't remember what the parent created. Or vice versa, sometimes the student will create that user ID and password for mom or dad, and then they don't remember what they created or which letters were capitalized or that type of thing. So you just want to be sure that you're very careful and keep up with the information. For the student in particular, that FSA ID is important all the way through school because you're going to use it every year to fill out the FAFSA. If the student borrows any federal student loans, they're also going to use that FSA ID to sign promissory notes for those loans online. They're going to use that information to access their financial aid history. So even after they leave school, if they're repaying loans or anything like that, that FSA ID will still be important to them. Okay, so it's important that you, excuse me, keep up with that information and just make it something that's easy to remember. Okay. All right, some things that are changing pretty significantly for financial aid is about to happen on October the 1st. Have any of you ever applied for, have any of you ever gone through the financial aid cycle with other children? Okay, so in the past, we always wanted to tell folks, you can file the FAFSA beginning in January of their senior year of high school. Well, this year, for the very first time ever, the Department of Education is allowing families to file the FAFSA beginning on October the 1st. This is a change that is coming about for a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons is to better align the financial aid process with the admission process and the deadlines that are generally used for admission. It's also hopefully going to enable families to be able to make decisions a little earlier about where to attend school, because we're hoping to get information to you earlier about what kinds of aid you're eligible to receive. Okay? So beginning October 1st, Saturday, the FAFSA will be available. Now, this change required another change to the FAFSA. Always in the past, you have used your previous year's income information to apply for financial aid. So, for instance, for the 16-17 school year that we're in right now, families started applying in January of this year, and they were using their 2015 income information, the year that had just ended. Okay? Well, if you can begin applying on Saturday, you're not going to have your 2016 income information available yet. So what the department is doing is they're using what's called prior year income. And what that means is instead of using the year prior, which would be 2016 for the 17-18 school year, they're going to use 2 years back. So they're using 2015 income information for the 17-18 school year. Okay, so the nice thing about this is that at this point, it's October of 2016. Even folks who filed a tax extension for 2015 should have their taxes filed by about now. Okay, so it's going to make it a little easier to use that data retrieval tool. So here's kind of what's going to happen. If your child is going to attend college in 17-18 school year, then you can start submitting the FAFSA on October 1st, that's this Saturday, and you're going to use income information from 2015, all right? That information for almost everyone should be readily available using the IRS data retrieval. If you have a student who's a junior this year, or for the student's sophomore year of college, for those of you that have a senior, if they are applying for financial aid for the 18-19 school year, then they'll be able to start doing that in October of 2017, a year from now, and you'll be using your 2016 income information. So it's always going to be income from 2 years prior. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyone that you talk to that works in financial aid is going to encourage you to file the FAFSA early. And the reason that we do that is because there are some funds that students may have eligibility for, but we run out of money before we run out of students to give those funds to. There are some things that are sort of bottomless pits. Pell Grants, if a student is eligible, they're going to get it. But we have other grants and some scholarship funds, depending on the school, where they have, if you will, if you kind of picture it, we've got a bucket of money, and once we spend that money, it's gone. And a lot of times those funds are awarded on a first-come, first-served basis. So the earlier you file the FAFSA, the more likely you are to be considered for those limited dollar funds. The state of Alabama does not have a tremendous amount of aid for students in college. So for our state, we don't really have deadlines because there's just not state money to be had. There are other states where they have very early deadlines for state grant money. So they want students to file the FAFSA early. But again, we typically do things on a first-come, first-served basis, and when I run out of money, I'm nowhere close to running out of eligible students. So the earlier you file, the more likely you are to be considered for those funds. We do, as I've mentioned, need your tax information that's used to determine the types of federal aid that your student may qualify for. And again, I really want to encourage you to use that data retrieval tool. Okay? So we get a lot of questions about, well, okay, so in my family we've got this situation. My parents are divorced or something has happened, and whose information do I put on the FAFSA? For most undergraduate students, they are going to be considered dependent. Generally, if you're under the age of 24, you are dependent for financial aid purposes. So for all of our high school seniors, Juniors, when you're applying for financial aid, you're going to have to provide your parents' information. The parent on the FAFSA is the person who is considered to be your biological or adoptive parents, okay? If parents are divorced, you provide the information of the parent with whom the student lived more during the last year, okay? So it doesn't matter who's paying for college, doesn't matter what the divorce decree says about who's supposed to pay for college. It's who did the student live with more during the last 12 months, all right? My parents are divorced. My father was paying for college, but we lived with my mother. So we always provided my mother's information. Didn't matter who was paying the bill, okay? If the parent is remarried, then the step-parent's information must be included even if the step-parent is not helping support the child, okay? And there's no way around that. And then if you have a situation where the parents are not married but they're living in the same household, both parents' information needs to be provided on the FAFSA, okay? All right, so let's talk about some what-if scenarios. What if a student lives with somebody other than mom or dad? Grandparents, aunts, uncles, foster parents, legal guardians are not considered to be parents for the FAFSA unless they have legally adopted that child. For scenarios where someone is in a legal guardianship, they've been in the foster care system, there are questions on the FAFSA that address those scenarios, and generally those students are considered to be independent for financial aid purposes, okay? If you have a situation where the student is living with grandparents, in most cases, the parent information is still going to have to be obtained. If the whereabouts of the parent are not known, those are situations that the school can help you address. If you've got something really unusual, I would encourage you to talk to the school that your child's interested in attending to get more information, find out what documentation they may ask you for. Because at UAB, if you tell us that if the student tells us they are in a legal guardianship, we are going to ask for that documentation. Some schools do, some do not, okay? If someone other than the parent claims them on their tax return, doesn't matter, parents' information is still provided, okay? And if the student is an emancipated minor, is considered to be homeless, or is an orphan, then those are again situations that are addressed on the FAFSA. Those students are generally considered to be independent for financial aid purposes. That just means there's no parental information to provide. But again, those are situations that most schools are going to ask for documentation for, okay? What if a student thinks they're independent for financial aid purposes? So we get this a lot where somebody will say, you know, I don't claim my child, and she's paying all of her own bills, she's living in an apartment, and she pays her own rent. Doesn't matter. If she's under the age of 24, generally she's going to be considered a dependent student. The things that make a student independent are being married, being a veteran, having a child that they provide more than half of the support for. Those types of scenarios would make someone under the age of 24 independent. I don't really recommend any of those for somebody that's 18 years old. You know, they're too young generally to be a veteran, and I don't want everybody running out and getting married. So just keep in mind, if you're under the age of 24, you're going to be considered dependent for financial aid. And mom and dad's information, or whatever parent you live with, is going to have to provide income information, okay? If the parents are not U.S. citizens or they are not legal immigrants, then that's a situation to contact the financial aid office at the school about. They are probably going to need to fill out a paper FAFSA because they will not have a social security number, and so they're not going to be allowed to fill out the online version of the FAFSA. Okay. So you complete the FAFSA, you submit it. What happens next? Well, generally, it takes about 3 to 5 days for the federal processor to work through the application. Once they've done that, they will send the student – an email letting them know that the information is ready to be reviewed. please, please, please go out to the website and make sure everything is correct. Because if we don't get good information, it's impossible for us to give you good information about what the student may qualify for. All of the information that you're providing on the FAFSA is being used to create what's called an expected family contribution, or an EFC. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that is a significant number for financial aid purposes, okay? We get the information electronically. The Department of Ed sends schools files every day, and then the financial aid office will let you know if there's more information that we need. Sometimes we have to ask for more documentation. It may be because the student has said they were in a legal guardianship. It may be that the Department of Ed has said, hey, the school needs to review this information. You're going to have to provide them more documentation. But generally, we're going to get the information within 3 to 5 days. I mentioned that expected family contribution, or EFC. That number is calculated using what's called federal methodology. It's a formula that the Department of Ed uses. They take a lot of things into consideration. It's not just based on your income. It's based on things like the age of the older parent, because as we get older, more of our income is protected for retirement. It's based on the state in which you reside, because it takes into consideration the fact that there are states that don't have a state income tax and states that do. It is based on how many people are in the household and how many children you will have in college during that school year. Because if you've got one child in college, then your resources could be directed to that one student. If you're going to have 3 in college at the same time, then your resources are basically divided by 3, right? So a lot of people, when they see that EFC, and you'll be able to see it once your information is processed by the Department of Ed, they look at it and they say, well, there's just no way that I can contribute that much money. A lot of people feel that way. Y'all, it's just a number. It is the most equitable way that we have right now to award federal aid. It does not mean that that is the amount you will be required to pay. It does not mean that's the bill you're going to get from the school would not be for that amount. It's just a number that we are using to make it as fair as possible across the board for families. You know, if you are fortunate and your son or daughter qualifies for lots of scholarship money, you may be in a position where you don't have to pay for anything. And that would be fabulous. Your child may get enough grant money or things like that to help pay for school, and you may not need to contribute much. There are other students who are not going to be in that situation, and the family may have to try to figure out, you know, how are we going to help pay for school? So it varies greatly, but just don't get upset when you see that EFC. I've had families come to me and say, my EFC is $10,200 and I don't have that much money. And I think that's a very normal reaction. So I'm just heading it off at the pass. Just don't panic when you see it, okay? About 1/3 of all students who fill out the FAFSA are selected for a process called verification. All verification means is that the Department of Ed has said, hey, we need for the school to review this information. If you are selected for verification, the school will contact you and say, these are the things we need. In most cases, they're going to need a copy of a tax return transcript, which you have to request from the IRS. It's not just a copy of your 1040. But if you use that IRS data retrieval and you pull that information over from the IRS, put it in the FAFSA, and you don't change any of it, then you don't have to ask for that tax return transcript. Okay, because we already have the data straight from the IRS. There's no point in getting something else from the IRS. But you may have some other forms and things that we may need for you to fill out. Okay. Now, there are situations where, you know, things just don't fit. You're going to be filling out the FAFSA using 2015 income information. Well, your income may have changed dramatically from 2015 until now. Maybe someone's lost a job, or you know that you used to have lots of overtime and you don't have overtime anymore, so there's been a significant change in income. Or maybe when you filled out your 2015 tax information, you were married and now you're in the process of getting a divorce, there are unusual situations that occur, and schools do have the ability to use what's called professional judgment to make changes to a family's FAFSA information. We have to document it, we have policies and procedures that we have to follow, and all schools do things differently. For instance, some of the scenarios that we could address, as I mentioned, like the death or divorce of a parent, a significant reduction of income, those are the two that we see the most often. We generally do not make adjustments for like a lot of out-of-pocket medical expenses, but that's also something we just don't see a lot of. I used to work at a private university, and one of the things that we made a ton of adjustments for was a child that had siblings that went to a private high school. So the parents are paying tuition at a private, around here it would have been Briarwood or one of the other private schools. And that's something we made an adjustment for. Public schools almost never make adjustments for that. So here at UAB, that's not something that we make an adjustment for. So it's entirely up to the school as to what they'll consider and what they want. So I say all of that to tell you that if you've had one of these situations occur, and you're looking at two schools and trying to decide between school A and school B, and you talk to both schools about whatever situation has occurred, don't be surprised if they handle it differently. Okay? One school may say, oh yeah, we can make adjustments for that, and another school may say, oh, well, that's really not something we do. It's entirely up to the school, so just something to be aware of. Also, they may both make an adjustment, but it may not be the same type of adjustment. So, one may have a bigger benefit to you than the other. Just something to be aware of. For all of these types of situations, there are forms and documentation that need to be provided, and those again are school specific, so it's just something to be talking to your financial aid office about once you've filled out the FAFSA. We fully anticipate at UAB that because folks are not using the income from the year that just ended, but they're using it from 2 years prior, that we're going to see more requests based on reduction of income. Jobs have changed, or someone in the family is no longer employed for whatever reason, and I think we just anticipate we're gonna have more requests than we've had in the past. So. All right, so let's talk about the different kinds of federal financial aid. There are really two types. There's need-based and non-need-based. We'll talk a little bit about each of the programs that are listed here. Pell Grants are considered the foundation of federal financial aid. It's the oldest federal program. They've been around since the late 60s, and they are only available to undergraduate students who are working on a first bachelor's degree, and they are only available to students with very low EFCs, those low expected family contributions. The amount of Pell varies from year to year because it's an appropriated fund, which means we're waiting on Congress to come up with a budget to tell us how much money is available in Pell. The maximum Pell Grant for this current school year is $5,815. The minimum Pell Grant for a full-time student for this school year is $400. So there's a huge range between $5,800 and $400 of students who qualify for Pell money. The highest EFC that can get Pell this year is $5,234. Okay? So if someone's EFC is $5,234 and they're a full-time student, they're that group that gets $400 in Pell Grant money. If their EFC is $5,235, they get no Pell Grant money. Okay? But we also have families where the EFC is 0. And so those are the families who get that maximum $5,815. Okay? Pell does change every single year. We've been really fortunate for years. It has gone up. It doesn't go up a lot from year to year, but it goes up, and up is always better than down. Okay? The award amount is based on the student's enrollment status. So a student has to be full-time to get their full award. If they're not taking classes as a full-time student, it's going to be prorated based on their enrollment. For undergraduate students, full-time is considered to be 12 hours, okay? Students are also limited to 6 years of Pell Grant eligibility. We all want them to graduate, right? So after you've been here for 6 years taking undergraduate courses, we are going to assume that you are ready to walk the stage. If you are not ready to walk the stage, you are going to have a much harder time paying for school because the resources that are available to you are dwindling at that point. The SEOG is the Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant. This is a grant that is intended to go to undergraduate students who have very low EFCs. So typically what happens is this is money that also goes to Pell Grant students. This is a limited dollar fund. Not all schools participate in this program. Most do, but not all. And we essentially have a bucket of money. And when the bucket is empty, it's empty. So this is one of those grants that the earlier you fill out the FAFSA, the more likely you are to get funds from this grant, okay? It is up to the school to determine how much they are going to award to each student and how they are going to choose the recipients. My experience has been that an awful lot of schools do it on a first-come, first-served basis. Okay. So again, the earlier you file, the better. Federal direct student loans. I'm going to tell you up front that I do not want anybody to borrow money for college if they don't have to. But the reality is that the vast majority of students in the United States graduate with some student debt. Okay? Y'all, it's an investment. You know, we go into debt for our house, we go into debt to buy a car. This is an investment just like especially just like your home is, because this is something you're going to have with you forever. But it is a way to allow students to borrow money in their own name to help pay the cost of going to school. There are two types of federal direct loans. There's a subsidized loan, which is a need-based loan, and an unsubsidized loan, which is not a need-based loan. Your need is based on the information you provide on the FAFSA. So what happens is a school will say, okay, our cost of attendance for this school year is X amount of money. Now when I say cost of attendance, what I mean is tuition and fees, room and board, even if the student doesn't live on campus, or if they're living at home or in an apartment, they still have room and board expenses because they're not going to eat every meal at home, right, even if they live at home. Transportation costs back and forth going to school. For students who live on campus, it's sort of, you know, a couple of trips home if home is not close by. Just miscellaneous expenses, stuff, laundry, clothes, movie tickets, you know, those kinds of things. So we calculate a cost of attendance. And to determine if you qualify for need-based aid, we're taking the cost of attendance minus that EFC. All right, so if the cost of attendance is $10,000 and your EFC is $2,000, then you've got $8,000 in need, okay? And if you qualify for Pell, then we're gonna put a Pell Grant award in there. And we're just slowly starting to deduct, and if you still have need after scholarships and grants, then you would qualify for a need-based loan, okay? But even if Bill Gates' child was coming to college and Bill wanted them to take out a student loan, they would qualify for a non-need-based loan. So every student who is, you know, if you're eligible for federal aid, you are eligible for a federal loan, okay? The difference between the two is that on a subsidized loan, no interest accrues while the student's in school. On an unsubsidized loan, interest begins to accrue when the money is dispersed to the student's account, okay? There are annual limits on what a student can borrow. For a freshman, a dependent freshman can borrow no more than $5,500 for the entire year. So generally, a loan is not enough to completely pay for the cost of attending school, okay? An independent freshman can borrow no more than $9,500 for the entire year. And typically that money is split fall, spring, so it's just split evenly, all right? As a student goes through school, those annual limits increase a little bit, so a junior can borrow more than a freshman. A graduate student can borrow more than an undergrad. Right? There are also limits of time on how long a student can borrow student loans. It's kind of like the limit on Pell, where, and this is fairly new, but essentially if there's a student in a 4-year program, the Department of Ed has said, okay, you can borrow subsidized loans for no more than 6 years. And after that, no more subsidized loans, because on a subsidized loan, the federal government's actually paying the interest that's accruing instead of it going to the borrower. So it's an expensive loan program for taxpayers. I mean, we're funding this. So they just eliminate that interest subsidy after a student. If you're in school 6 years and you still haven't gotten a degree, we're going to let interest start accruing and you don't get any more of the interest-free loans. The interest rate on these loans is set every year, and then it's set for the life of the loan. So this year the interest rate for an undergrad is 3.76%. For a graduate student, it's a little more expensive to borrow. It's 5.31%. Okay. Next May, early June, the interest rates will be set for the 17-18 school year. They went down this year. It's based on Treasury bill auctions, so it varies a little bit from year to year. Students have to be enrolled at least half-time. To get a federal direct loan, half-time would be 6 hours for an undergraduate student. These are not credit-based loans. Most 18-year-olds do not have any kind of credit history. So they are not credit-based. If you are eligible, you receive them. There is no repayment required until the student leaves school or falls below half-time. Okay? Once the student graduates or leaves school, then there's a 6-month grace period before repayment begins. So it's not that you graduate in April and you start paying back in May. All right? You graduate in April, you start paying back in November or December. Okay? The standard repayment period on student loans is 10 years. But y'all, you've probably seen in the news, there are all kinds of student loan repayment options. And there are a lot of forgiveness provisions for some students. Students who go into certain areas of public service can have loans forgiven. Students who have low income after they graduate can have student loans forgiven after a period of time. Repayment can also be stretched out for a much longer period of time than 10 years. If you know, we have students who borrow as an undergrad, then they go to grad school, or they go to medical school or law school, and some of those students have a significant amount of debt when they graduate. They can stretch out their student loan payments for up to 30 years. Y'all, that's a mortgage. I mean, it's hard to imagine repaying student loans that long, but there are a lot of different options for repaying those loans, okay? 10 years is just the standard repayment. All right, let's talk a little bit about work study. Work study is a need-based program, so students have to have financial need. Allows them to be employed either in on-campus jobs or in certain off-campus jobs, and most of those are community service related. It does not give them money to help pay their tuition at the beginning of the semester, because the student is paid as they work, just like they would be if they worked at Macy's or Chili's or anywhere else. But it is a really good way to get work experience. I will tell you, in my opinion, one of the benefits of working on campus is that on-campus employers know that your student is here to be a student. And you know, we know that there are exams. We know that there are social events that they're going to want to attend. And for the most part, you're going to find that on-campus employers are going to be really willing to work with students on their schedules and things like that. That may not always be the case if you work, you know, for a retailer or a restaurant or something like that. They need you there when they need you there. This is a limited dollar fund. This is another one where we basically have a bucket of money to spend on work study, and once we have promised that to students and the bucket is empty, it's empty. We keep a running wait list of students who want work study funds. We always have more students than we have money. There is a question on the FAFSA that asks if you are interested in work study, For a lot of schools, if you say no to that question, then you wouldn't be considered for work-study funds. So, we generally encourage students to say yes. You can always be offered work-study and decide you don't want to do it, but you don't want to miss out on the offer, okay? This is another program that not all schools participate in. And it's because generally the school has to provide a portion of the funding to help pay the students. It's not all federal dollars. So some schools just don't have the resources to do that. Okay. The Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant is not a need-based program. This is the newest federal aid program, and it's been around now for about 10 years, and we have just this year at UAB had our very first recipient. It is available to students who lost a parent or guardian as a result of military action in Iraq or Afghanistan after 9/11. The award is intended to be the same amount as the maximum Pell for that year. A student cannot get Pell and the Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant. It is only available to undergraduate students, and the student has to have been under the age of 24 at the time of the parent's death or enrolled in college at the time of the parent's death. Schools are not seeing a lot of these recipients yet, and I think it's just timing. Folks who lost a parent in Iraq or Afghanistan are probably just not old enough to be in college yet. A lot of those service members had very young children, and like I said, UAB has its very first one this year, and the program's been around now for just under 10 years, I guess. But it is a good program. It's something that's self-reported, so if your family was affected by, has lost someone due to military service, then there is information on the FAFSA that addresses that. Okay. All right, the TEACH grant program. TEACH stands for the Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education Grant. Did y'all know there are people in Congress that come up with names and acronyms for them? TEACH grant is available to students who want to teach in low-income areas in high-need fields. The high-need fields are the sciences, math, certain foreign languages. They are languages that are deemed critical by the Department of Defense. So you can imagine the type, they're the Middle Eastern languages. That's what they're looking for. English as a second language, special education. For students who plan to teach in one of those areas, TEACH grants are available. Y'all, I'm going to tell you, be very honest, this is not something I recommend to a college freshman. And the reason I don't recommend it is that there are some conditions attached to receiving this money. The first is that when you get the money, you are signing what's called an agreement to serve, and you're agreeing to teach for 4 years within an 8-year period after you leave school. And you have to teach in a low-income, high-need area. If you don't fulfill that agreement, then this grant turns into a loan. And interest on that loan is going to be calculated all the way back to the time you first got the grant money. Okay? So let's say I'm a freshman in college and I'm an education major and I know I want to teach. So I get the TEACH grant my freshman year, my sophomore year, my junior year, my senior year. I get out of school and either I don't find a teaching job, or I've gotten married and I'm expecting a child and I'm not going to teach. If I don't complete that agreement to serve, if I don't fulfill the terms of that agreement to serve, then all of that money that I borrowed turns into a loan. Okay? And they're going to calculate interest all the way back to my freshman year in college. Students can get up to $4,000 a year. An undergrad can receive it for 4 years and a graduate for 2 years. This is a great program for graduate students because by then they really are much more focused on what they want to do. I changed my major probably 4 times my freshman year, and I think that's pretty typical. So it is available. I'm not going to tell a student they can't have it. It's just not something that I necessarily recommend for a freshman. It's just there's a commitment there that may be too much to take on. So, Okay. The last program I'll talk about is the Parent Plus loan. This is a loan that, as the name indicates, is in the parent's name. It is a low-interest loan that helps parents pay the cost of the child's education. They are not need-based loans, but they are credit-based loans. Okay? Student loans are not credit-based. Parent loans are. The credit criteria is not based so much on your ability to repay like a mortgage is, but what they're looking at when they run a credit check is negative credit. So if you have, if somebody has credit cards that have been 90 days late, that may keep you from being approved. Or if you've got medical bills or you've defaulted on loans in the past and those things are on your credit history, that may keep a parent from being approved. Borrowers can have a cosigner sign the loan with them. To determine eligibility for a parent loan, it's really based on what is the cost of attendance, how much aid is the student already receiving, and the parent can borrow the difference. Okay. The interest rate on this loan caps out at 9%. It's really much lower than that right now. It's 6.31%. Parent loans generally go into repayment once the loan is completely dispersed. So when I say that, what I mean is if you borrow for the whole school year, you would generally get half of the money in the fall, half of it in the spring. After that spring money is dispersed, that's when repayment would begin. It can be deferred while the student's enrolled in school, but that's something that you have to make a request of to the loan servicer. It's not automatic. Okay. Studentloans.gov is actually the website where you would apply for a parent loan. There's also some good information out there. So that's a website I would encourage you to take a look at. But the application process is online, and different schools handle PLUS loans a little differently. I also want to tell you that not every school participates in loan programs. The ones that typically don't may be community colleges. I don't know of any four-year schools that don't participate in loan programs, but if you are looking at some of the community colleges, some of them do not do loans. All right, unfortunately, in most cases, federal money is not going to pay for everything. There are certainly other resources to explore. You want to apply for any scholarships that you may be eligible for, because that's money that doesn't have to be repaid, and that's awesome. Schools typically have very early deadlines for applying for scholarships. Outside agencies, things like churches, employers, community organizations, the Kiwanis Club and those types of things, a lot of them offer scholarship dollars. Sometimes there's an essay that's required. Sometimes it's just filling out the application. I talked to someone on Saturday that was from Pennsylvania, and they got a full ride scholarship to a school here in Alabama because they were the only student in Pennsylvania that applied for this Pennsylvania Alumni Scholarship. They had like a 2.2 GPA in high school, y'all, but they were the only one that applied. They got a full tuition scholarship for 4 years. So sometimes you just have to kind of know what's out there. There are scholarship search engines. FastWeb is a fairly good one. It is owned by Monster. So if you sign up with FastWeb, you may start getting some emails from other Monster companies. You can opt out of them, but just know that that's who it's managed by. But it's a good scholarship search engine. Scholarships.com is another good one. And then careerinfonet.org is also a good scholarship search engine. Please don't pay anyone to look for scholarship dollars for you, because all they're doing is doing the same kind of online search you can do yourself. But they will happily take your money to do it. Okay. One resource that I want to, well, two resources that I want to point out to you that are on, this one's on our website. UAB subscribes to a, a feature called Financial Aid TV. You can go out to our website. You don't have to have a login or anything like that. It's available to anyone. And you can access what's called Financial Aid TV. And there are little short video clips about an awful lot of different facets of federal student aid. Filling out the FAFSA, applying for a loan. There are things out there about GI Bill benefits, how to accept, an award, lots of different topics that you can go to. Very short video clips, so they're not something that you're going to have to sit down and listen to for 45 minutes. They're just a couple of minutes in length, but some good, helpful information. The other thing is that all schools who participate in federal student aid programs are required to have on their website what's called a net price calculator. The net price calculator enables a student or a parent to go in and enter some pretty basic information. Some of them are fancier than others, so some of them will give you some scholarship information, some of them are strictly federal aid information, but it gives you a good idea of what you may qualify for. Y'all, it's an estimate, okay? So it's not set in stone, but it is a good way to get an idea of what your child may qualify for at that school. Some of them will ask questions about ACT or SAT scores, GPA. Others are more just income-based. But it's a good resource, and it is supposed to be by federal mandate on every school's website if they participate in federal aid programs. Okay? So you should be able to do that at any school you're considering. All right, and with that, I am going to wrap up.